Good afternoon. I'm Carlin Bowman, and I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I'd like to welcome all of you to today's program on the new American Family Survey. This is the seventh collaboration between the Deseret News and Brigham Young University, and we're very grateful to have the program. Every week, I review a huge number of public opinion polls, and most of them are chasing the news stories. Now, these polls aren't unimportant. We need to know how President Biden is faring, what people think of the Supreme Court, and what they think about Congress. But very few pollsters are digging down below the surface of these events overall. The American Family Survey makes a unique contribution in this regard. For the last 7 years, they've been looking at how ordinary Americans live their lives, their hopes, their fears about the present and about the future. Just to give you an example, in 2020, the survey took a deep dive into how American families were faring during the pandemic. And this year, they've gone even further in looking at that subject overall, in addition to looking at some of today's hot buttons, including families and race and what social interactions there are. Before turning the proceedings over to Doug Wilkes, who's the executive editor of the Deseret News, let me give a special thanks to Allison Pond, who's been coordinating this survey for a very long time, and also to my RA, Samantha Goldstein, who has helped with the complicated logistics for this event. It's now a pleasure for me to introduce Doug Wilkes, who will tell you more about the survey. Doug will also introduce Chris Karpowitz and Jeremy Pope, who will present the findings of the survey overall. Then we'll hear from our panelists, whose bios are all online. All of them have studied family well-being for many years. Marcy Carlson is a sociologist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she's written extensively about these issues. Brad Wilcox is my AEI colleague, a non-resident fellow, and also director of the Institute for Family Studies. And Richard Reeves is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and director of the Future of the Middle Class initiative there. Doug, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Carlin. I appreciate that. And I too welcome all of you to the release of the American Family Survey today. The annual nationwide study is by the Deseret News, here based in Salt Lake City, but with a national and actual international reach, and the Center for the Study of Elections and Democracy at BYU. Now in its seventh year, the survey is designed to understand the experiences of Americans in their relationships, marriages, and families, and how those experiences relate to a variety of public policy issues. This year, while much of the data confirms our concerns that America is deeply divided, the 2021 American Family Survey also provides hope, revealing really great resiliency by American families and some agreement in surprising ways, which they'll get into today. Most everyone, politically right, left, and center, found the government stimulus checks helpful for their families, for example. And families of all income brackets, demographics, and political parties have revealed that throughout both 2020 and 2021, they've experienced fewer economic hardships than they did in 2019 and in other years past. This is a remarkable finding, given the disruptions in Americans' lives since the pandemic began. Additionally, there are vastly different worldviews that American families are going to have to confront one way or another, particularly as it relates to race. How the history of race in America is taught in the classroom, for example, shows stark differences between Republicans and Democrats. We're very grateful for the work of the survey's advisory committee, Carlin, who introduced this meeting today of the American Enterprise Institute, and Marcy Carlson from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Richard Reeves of the Brookings Institution, and Brad Wilcox of AEI and the University of Virginia. Many have been with us for all 7 years, have been advising us, and their scholarship has been invaluable to what we're trying to do as a media organization, trying to reach and understand what's happening with the American family in all its many forms. The Deseret News and myself personally is also very grateful for the continued work of Professors Jeremy Pope and Christopher Karpowitz of BYU and their work with the Center of the Study of Elections and Democracy. We meet regularly together with Allison Pond, and putting together the survey, making a look at questions, what will be relevant, what will be newsworthy, and what can contribute to the scholarship. So I'm pleased now to turn the time over to both of them. And I believe, Chris, you're starting out. So please, Chris.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Doug. It's really a delight to be part of this group, and our collaboration with the Deseret News and with the members of our advisory board has been wonderful over the past 7 years. We're excited to share with you some of our findings today. This really is a wonderful opportunity to think about the experiences of the American family. The American Family Survey is a national survey of 3,000 Americans. It's conducted online with our partners at YouGov, and it's meant to mirror a representative sample of the American public. One of the things that we have, as Doug indicated, have spent time on this year is the experience of American families with COVID. And so I'll talk a little bit about that, and Jeremy will also talk about other topics. The survey typically includes a common set of questions that we ask every year. And then this year we've delved in deeper depth into the pandemic. And we noticed that the pandemic has touched the lives of most American families. We asked respondents to the survey to self-report whether someone in their family had been diagnosed with COVID and whether someone in the family had died. You can see that nearly half of Americans say someone in their family had been diagnosed. These aren't formal diagnoses, they are self-reports from the respondents. But nearly half say that they know someone in their family who has had COVID. And more than 1 in 10 say someone in their family, either immediate family or extended family, had died of COVID. But notice that there are stark differences across racial groups. So for white Americans, that's less than 1 in 10. But for Hispanic Americans, it's 1 in 5 who have had a family member die of COVID. We also look at some differences across income and partisanship. The pandemic affected Americans in different ways. One of the things we were curious about is whether American families were able to get the physical and mental health care that they needed during the pandemic. About 75% of our respondents said that they needed physical health care in the previous year, and about half said they needed mental health care. Of those who said they needed one or the other forms of care, we asked whether they were able to receive it. And you can see that there are dramatic differences across income categories. So among low-income Americans, which we define for purposes of this survey as Americans making less than $40,000 a year, a third did not receive needed physical care, and more than a half of Americans in that category who said they needed mental health care did not receive it. Those numbers are still large, but lower for those in the middle and higher incomes. What about financially? How have Americans weathered the storm of the pandemic? We asked how families' financial situations had changed since March of 2020. And across all income categories, most Americans said that it had stayed the same. A few say that it actually got better, and some say that it got worse. Notice, though, that there are, again, important income differences. So among low-income Americans, 28% said that their financial situation got worse. That's double the number who said it got better. Among high-income Americans, however, the numbers are almost the reverse. 14% said their financial situation got worse. 23% said it got better. Family structure also matters in addition to income. And you can see that the group that is most likely to say that their situation got worse are single parents with kids. 27%, more than a quarter, said their situation got worse, compared to about 8% who said that it got better. Again, that's all in the context of most Americans saying that their situation overall stayed the same. Of course, the pandemic brought changes in our patterns of work as well. We asked Americans who responded to the survey how many had worked from home at least once prior to March of 2020, and then how many had worked from home at least once after March of 2020. And you can see that before the pandemic really began in earnest, there wasn't much difference across income categories, but that really changed after March of 2020. Working from home is more common for all groups, but it was much more common for those in the highest income levels than those at the lower income levels. So again, the pandemic is affecting American families and American life, including work life, in different ways, depending on income and depending on other characteristics. Doug mentioned that one of the things that we see that was surprising to us over the last 2 years is whether or not Americans experienced an economic crisis. We see substantial declines in the percentage of Americans across all income categories who told us that they've experienced an economic crisis. By crisis, we mean one of several different things: not having a place to live, not having enough food, not being able to go to the doctor's office for an urgent healthcare need, not being able to pay all of an important monthly bill, other really big economic events like that. And you can see that relative to 2019, low, middle, and high income Americans told us that they experienced an economic crisis in lower percentages than they did in that year. And we see even further declines from 2020 in 2021. Well, how can that be? How is it that we've gone through a recession and a pandemic and levels of economic crisis have gone down? Well, part of the answer is that the federal government gave substantial aid to most American families. More than 8 in 10 of the respondents to the American Family Survey reported receiving federal stimulus checks during the pandemic. Of those who received the checks, we asked whether or not they needed the aid to get by. And you can see that substantial percentages in that first column across a variety of different characteristics said that they needed the aid to get by. That was most true of those in the lowest income category. So almost 3/4 of low-income Americans said that they needed the aid to get by, nearly a half of middle-income Americans, and still more than a quarter of high-income Americans said that they needed the aid to get by. Of those who said they needed the aid, we then asked them, well, how much did it help? Did it help a lot, some, or a little? And you can see that of those in the lowest income category, more than 8 in 10, almost 9 in 10 said that it helped a lot or it helped some. And so part of the reason why economic crisis has decreased is likely a result of this substantial federal aid. Again, we mentioned that single parents with kids were especially stressed by the pandemic, stressed financially, and 2/3 of them said that they needed the aid that they received to get by. And again, more than 8 in 10 single parents with kids said that the aid helped a lot or helped some. So in light of the experiences that all of us have had over the past couple of years, we asked how helpful various institutions have been in dealing with the challenges of the pandemic, how helpful they were and prepared they were for the pandemic. And we asked this question in 2020 and again in 2021. One of the things that was most striking is that 3 institutions improved substantially from 2021. Those were churches, state and local government, and the federal government, with the biggest increase being the federal government. When we break that down by partisanship, it's clear that part of what's happening is that Democrats dramatically change their views of what the federal government is doing as the White House changes hands from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. There is some corresponding decline among Republicans, but not nearly as steep as the increase among Democrats. And independents also rated the federal government as more helpful in 2021 than it was in 2020. Notably, there are increases in judgments about the helpfulness of state and local governments for all 3 groups, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, between 2020 and 2021. So part of what we're seeing is some politicization of views of the federal government, but widespread agreement across the 3 categories of partisanship that relative to 2020, state and local governments did better in 2021. What about relationships themselves? How are people appreciating their partners? How are family relationships being stressed by the pandemic? We asked whether or not the pandemic had made people who are married or cohabiting question the strength of their marriage or relationship. And you can see that very few Americans said that was the case. Only about 1 in 10 of those who were married or cohabiting. A few more than that, about double that, said it increased stress in their marriage or relationship. But by far, most Americans who answered this question said that the pandemic made them appreciate their partner more. So part of what's happening, even though the pandemic was stressful for American families, relationships appear to be a form of support and reliance that married and cohabiting Americans are relying on. Finally, for my part, we asked American families about race, given George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the widespread conversation about race. We asked whether racial discrimination had been an obstacle to their families in one of several different categories: education, social relationships, medical care, housing. And as you can see, there are dramatic differences across racial and ethnic groups with respect to this. Only about 1 in 10 white Americans say that racial discrimination is an obstacle for them, compared to about half of Black families and about 1/3 of Hispanic families. We also asked how schools should talk about race and teach about race in America today. And we asked about 2 things. First, whether there had been significant progress toward racial equality in the United States. And second, whether schools should teach about the history of racism in the United States. And notably, there's not dramatic difference across partisan groups with respect to teaching about progress toward racial equality. So large percentages of Democrats and Republicans think that it's important to tell the story of racial progress in schools. But whether or not they want to sort of directly confront the history of racism in the United States, that question is polarized dramatically by partisanship. And note that the biggest differences are among white Americans with respect to this question. Whereas white Democrats really want to lean into the history of racism in the United States, white Republicans are far less interested in that. And note that, again, non-white respondents to the survey are less polarized, even though there are still differences across partisan groups. Finally, we also asked the extent to which American families are having social interactions or positive interactions across lines of race. And we asked about 4 different things, and each panel in this figure represents one of 4 different activities: serving as a job reference for someone of another race, arranging a play date with a family of another race, hosting in your home an individual of another race, or doing none of the above. There are some differences across income categories. So I think this is an issue where we'll be watching these sorts of activities and maybe expanding our discussion, or our set of activities that we ask about in the future. So there are income differences, but the overriding result here is that many American families report not having any of these sorts of interactions across lines of race over the past 5 years. So we gave a pretty wide set of years to report upon, and many Americans, almost 2/3 of low-income white and non-white respondents, said they'd done none of these things in the previous 5 years. So part of what's happening in terms of the racial divide is lack of interaction across those lines of race. And I'll turn it over now to my colleague, Jeremy Pope, to talk a little more.
So it's my job today to talk mostly about policy and then about the general state of how people perceive both their own families and marriage in general. I'm going to have one quick note on COVID that has to do with schools, and it's still certainly a very live policy issue to question how much should schools be open? Should they be mostly online? Should people be attending a little bit? The top half of that table that you see before you on the slides suggests that people, even in May of last year when the survey was fielded, and that's about what was asked that time period, sort of the end of school, lots of people were not at all attending school in person. 37% said they were not attending at all. 23% were attending a few times a week. 40% were attending in person every day. There are some interesting differences between Democrats and Republicans and across. We just have one income level and then race on that chart. I'm going to skip down to the bottom of the chart to just make one quick point that I think isn't perhaps fully appreciated in the conversation, which is when we look there, those are the people who were not attending. And so it's not the full sample. The bottom half of the table is just people that were not attending. And we asked them why. And for about 1/3 of them, it was because the school was not offering a full-time option. But over half said that they had the option, but they chose not to attend full-time. It is the case, I think, that there is a kind of narrative out there that school administrators or teacher unions or something like that that they prevented people from sending their children to school full-time. But the evidence in this survey is pretty strong that people were choosing this and that people were interested in having a public policy, at least in May of last year, where they weren't sending their kids to school full-time. We didn't ask as much about the upcoming school year. We didn't know Delta was going to be as serious an issue as it was, but I think this is probably a public policy issue that's going to go on. But we're going to turn now, if we could go to the next slide, to discussing people's general attitudes about how much help families should receive. And this year, one of the things that I think we focused on the most was essentially a child allowance. You might think of it as a universal basic income, but I think the way it's been portrayed most consistently is a child allowance or an income help for families. And the first question that we asked people, and we asked a number, not all of which I can report on in the short time that we have, was should parents or should the government send help to families directly? Should it spend money on programs and institutions? Should it do both? Should it do neither? And as you can see there, the general attitude among most people is that the government should be helping people. There's some difference of opinion between whether or not it should be helping families directly or spending money on programs or doing both. It is not as popular, though as you can see, it is popular among Republicans for the government to be doing nothing. But I want to focus on Republicans for just a second. I will note that it is still true that the average Republican wants some form of help going to families. They don't want the government to stay out of family life completely, though about 43% of Republicans do feel that way. So a baseline point to make here is that the public does want help. We did ask people about should families receive a child benefit of some sort, and this is a simple histogram that shows the preferred size in hundreds of dollars. We let the question range from zero hundreds up to $6,000 essentially, and we report there in the text what is the approximate average rounded to the nearest hundred that each of the partisan groups, that's pure independents, with the leaners collapse with Republicans and Democrats, what would they prefer? Republicans, with a fairly large number of them saying zero, drag that number down quite a bit to about $1,300 a month. Independents are in between at $2,300, and Democrats are by far the most generous at $3,000 a month. By the way, I won't show the picture here, but you can look this up in the report. It is clear that though family structure and whether or not you have kids makes a difference here, partisanship is the thing that, at least at the moment, structures opinion the best about whether or not people should be receiving some kind of yearly child tax benefit. I am reluctant as a card-carrying social scientist to make too much about causality when we ask a hypothetical. And yet we did want to ask people, do you think that if the government were to pay parents, say $300 a month or $3,600 a year per child, how would that affect your desire to have a child in the next 5 years? And here we look at just total responses in the green color, and then in pink, just those who are under age 40. And I won't make too much of these numbers, but I will point out that about, say, 17% of those in the rough childbearing years and about 14% overall say that it would make a difference to their fertility. And that gives a kind of at least plausibility about the idea that this benefit would have an effect on fertility, which is something that I think a lot of policymakers have discussed and want us to be thinking about. Let's turn to families more generally, if we could. And one of the things that we've consistently done with this survey is ask people what sort of problems face families the most, and or the most important for those families. And we have tended to group these into cultural, economic, and family structure areas. The public in general tends to favor structure as being the most important area where they think that families are facing big problems. To be honest, that has to do mostly with people thinking about single parent homes, but then even more so about the lack of discipline that they see, at least in other people's children. I think that's probably the way that I would like to put it. We see broad stability there. People tend to rate economic factors higher than family structure. I want to go to the next slide, though, and talk about partisan differences. And this compares our original year of 2015 with our most recent year. And each one of the panels, left to right, show cultural, economic, and structural answers. And what you notice when you look at the Republicans in red, the independents in green, pure independents again, and the Democrats in blue, is that Republicans are pretty stable in their evaluation of these problems. They have not changed their minds about how serious these problems are in the time that we've been doing this survey. But Democrats are quite different. Democrats in particular on cultural issues, they used to think those were extremely important, and now fewer than 4 in 10 Democrats think those are extremely important issues. Democrats have changed quite a bit. Independents haven't changed as much, but to the degree they have changed, they have moved in the same direction that Democrats have. And you could certainly call this a kind of polarization or sorting of people on the dimension of what issues face families. And I think this is going to mean in the future that policymakers have to think hard about what is it that Democrats and Republicans want with respect to family policy. Let's turn to one other area that is not, I admit, obviously about family, but I found the answer striking enough that I wanted to put this in our report today, and it is in the survey. We asked people about a number of areas where government policy affects families and asked them, how much concern do you have about each of these over time? The issues being inflation, lack of government assistance, national debt, and unemployment. Inflation is in that nice pink color there. And it is consistently the thing that the public is most worried about, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, black, white, whether you're low income. In fact, I could give a number of other demographic groups. There is a clear worry about inflation in the public that crosses demographic categories, and that the public probably is requesting their policymakers pay more attention to. And it's definitely something that I think people should be concerned about. On this graph, I will admit, it is striking how Republicans are the group that is worried about the national debt. But the thing that I think is the most important is that consistently people across all groups are worried about inflation. Now, one of the things we've done on this survey every year is simply ask about how is your marriage going? How are marriages generally going? And then the same thing about families. This graph here plots how is your family doing, or is it getting weaker, stronger? Is it about the same? What is taking place? And what we see is broad stability. Yes, technically in 2020 and 2021, the number of people saying that their marriage was about the same have gone up, but I don't know that I think that's a massive difference. Maybe something worth talking about in the Q&A. If you go to the next slide about family, you see essentially the same thing. There's a lot of stability here. Families and marriages tend to be in good shape. There is a slight drift down in how families generally are doing. People, saying maybe they're a little bit more weaker than they have been in the past, but in general, that trend is down. I want to focus for the last little bit on this slide, which I think takes some explanation. If you just stand back and stare at this slide, it looks generally like there's a lot of stability. And I think that's a reasonable characterization of it. But I think if you dig down into some of the answers that people are giving to this battery of questions that we call our kind of, beliefs about marriage battery, you'll see that there is a bit of weakening in how people are evaluating marriage as an institution. And I think that's worth talking about. So just to highlight it, if you look at that orange colored category, is marriage needed in order to create strong families? That's gone from 63% in 2017 down to 52% in 2021. If you asked in the green category, when more people are married, society is better off. That's gone from a high of 56 down to 45. If you look at the sort of pink one down at the bottom, is marriage old-fashioned and out of date? It was just 14% saying that a few years ago. Now it is ticking up. It was 20% in 2020, and it was 19% in 2021. I think this is cause for concern, but not alarm. It's something that we should be talking about because there is a kind of slight, but I would say significant erosion in how people are evaluating families. Okay, just to clean things up, these are some of our summary points about the American family. We think it's in a pretty good-ish state. There are challenges. We don't want to be Pollyanna about this. COVID didn't break families. And to the degree you hear about that narrative, we think that's probably wrong. And it's partially wrong because government assistance was so effective to people. Chris talked about some of those racial differences that remain significant in education policy. I anticipate we'll keep asking about that. Lastly, we do want to make clear that the public wants families to get help. I didn't get a chance to mention this, but they do actually want the right families to get help. The public does see limitations on what your income level should be for you to get help. And finally, the thing I mentioned at the end, there is a worrisome softening in support for the institution of marriage, not necessarily cause for alarm yet, but certainly cause for discussion. I think we'll leave it there so we can turn to the panel. Thank you.
Jeremy and Chris, thank you very much. That was clear, it was comprehensive, and you were both very concise. Before turning to our panelists, and Marcy's going to speak first, I'd like to remind all of you that we will be taking questions at the end of this session, and you're able to send your questions by going to samantha.goldstein@aei.org or using the hashtag AFS@AEI on Twitter. So Marcy, your reactions to the survey. And again, you have about 7 to 10 minutes.
Great, thank you so much, Carlin. And thanks to the team that pulled this together. Huge congratulations to Chris and Jeremy and Allison and Doug at the Deseret News on yet another excellent report summarizing the American Family Survey now in its 7th year. I think this survey does a really terrific job and a unique job of providing a snapshot of how families are doing, and I'm really honored to be part of the advisory committee. So this year's survey came amidst a really difficult time in American life, right? So fielded in late June and early July when Americans had been living with the COVID-19 pandemic for more than a year. And the uncertainty continued, frankly, it still continues with the Delta variant, right? This is a tough time in American life. And so in my few minutes, what I'd like to highlight is 3 points that I think come out of the report. And Chris and Jeremy have already highlighted some aspects of this, but I'll just reiterate things that struck me, having to do with resilience, inequality, and support. So resilience, right? This is in the title of the report, but I think it bears repeating. Americans generally perceive families and marriages, both their own and in general, as quite strong. And they appreciated the support of their partners during this recent period, despite the fact that there were many challenges and many people found family life a bit harder. But overall, the family emerged quite strong from the pandemic. Yes, there has been some decline in the strength of family life, but to me, it would be shocking if there wasn't, right? Life basically grind to a halt for most of us in March of 2020, and families had to adapt quickly to shifting work circumstances, to many schools going completely online, and education happening for the most part within the home. And for many families, this meant being together, if not 24/7, a lot more than they had been before, right? So you would expect that with all of these changes and almost everything suddenly happening within the home, there would be some challenges to family. So yes, indeed, families have been under stress, but they've generally weathered these storms quite well. And I think in the past two surveys, the trend line does show some decline, but it was not a dramatic decline, right? And I think given everything that has happened that's involved and affected families, I think we'd be surprised if we didn't see some shift. And I think the interesting thing will be what comes out after the pandemic, right? Is this just a period effect, as demographers might say, or is there really going to be a lingering impact of the pandemic and how it affects family life as we move into the future? And I think future surveys will help us understand that. So resilience would be my first point. So second point is about inequality. I won't summarize all the details of the report. It's beautifully written, and Chris and Jeremy talked about some of them, but I think it's hard to walk away from the summary of this report without taking note of the incredible differences by socioeconomic status, measured here by income, by race, and by gender. And there were a host of them. And I think in general, those who are most disadvantaged socioeconomically, racial and ethnic minorities, and women experience bigger effects, more profound effects of the pandemic in a variety of ways. Just one example, and this was highlighted in the summary, higher income professional workers were much more able to shift their work to be fully remote than lower income workers, right? And so this difference, I think it was about 70% of the higher income workers had worked at home, meant a really different experience of the pandemic and of work life during this particular time. And so I think I would encourage everyone to look at the report, pay attention to these inequalities that emerge across a range of subgroups. And I think that is something to be mindful of and attend to as we look to the future. I think one thing that was striking that wasn't quite or very different had to do with mental health and weight gain. So I took note that they asked about had there been an increase in sadness and depression. Overall, there was about a third of people reported an increase, but this didn't really vary much by income, from about 29 to 34% of people overall. Similarly, 33 to 35% of people reported an increase or gain in weight, right? So despite the fact that there are many inequalities that happen, I think the sort of mental or socio-emotional health maybe didn't vary as much across subgroups. But the inequality is big, and that's really my second takeaway. And then the third takeaway for me, it has to do with support, right? So support was really important during the pandemic. Many Americans benefited from the federal government's response to the pandemic, with fully 84% of people reporting that they received a stimulus check. That's a huge fraction of the American population. And this was before the Biden child tax credit that provides the largest child tax credit ever and historic relief to most families that was enacted or payments started in the middle of the summer, and those are fully $2,000 to $3,600 per child. So Chris and Jeremy talked about kind of what people want in terms of that policy, but at least for now that policy is in place and will provide even more support for families with children. And so government generally isn't an institution that garners a lot of love, but the fraction of people who reported the federal government as helpful went up notably, from 37 to 54%. And as was noted earlier, there's some partisan differences here, right? With a major increase among Democrats and independents, a decline among Republicans as the presidency went from Republican to Democrat. But the state numbers tell a very similar pattern of increase in perceived helpfulness of government, regardless of party affiliation. Overall, going from about a third of people to nearly half of people who said that state and local governments were helpful. And frankly, state governments weren't the main actors with respect to pandemic relief. So I take this as an increasingly positive view of government overall. So churches were another institution that were perceived as being increasingly helpful during the pandemic. And I think a lot of churches responded by shifting activities online, but continuing to stay in touch with their members and to welcome new people, even though that was in a very different form. And so I think the response of institutions, government and churches, is really striking and provided important support to families during this difficult time. So overall, I would say America has been through this profound shock in the form of a pandemic. It has affected really all aspects of life, and the fact that families emerge quite strong, I would say, is a positive coming out of this report. A couple things to note. I was really struck by the fact that neighbors weren't perceived as being much more supportive over time, even though people were spending a lot more time in their homes and a lot more time interacting, presumably in neighborhoods. I think that's something to be mindful of. And then I think the fact that very few people interacted across race groups, I think also signals that maybe there's more to be done in terms of interacting. And I think some of the more local institutions, I think, could potentially be strengthened as we try to move forward after the pandemic. So overall, I would say that America has been through a lot, right? And we emerge with a sense of resilience, a concern, in my view, about inequality, and yet the fact that institutions and especially government responded quite effectively and continues to respond effectively, I think is a point of encouragement. So I'll stop there and I'll turn it over to Carlin. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Marcy. I think you can all tell already that this is a very rich survey. You can get the full report on the survey from the Deseret News at www.deseret.com. Sorry, www.deseret.com. Brad, let's turn to you for your reactions.
Thank you, Carlin. Let me try to share also my screen here. And let's see here. Can you see that, Carlin?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to speak briefly about one of the sort of insights I think the survey gives us, and that is that there's a kind of, I think, a marriage paradox that emerges from this most recent American Family Survey. And so when we kind of think about this idea, I think we see is that both kind of culturally and practically, we've got more evidence in the survey that marriage is losing ground. We see, for instance, in the survey, the value of marriage continues to decline for those who are surveyed, with only 45% of Americans saying, quote, when more people are married, society is better off. And that's the lowest level in the history of this survey. That's kind of cultural evidence that marriage is kind of losing ground here. We can see in other work that I've done with colleagues that the marriage rate continues to fall in this country, and that's also, I think, evidenced in this survey as well. And this is kind of striking because in a world that's been turned upside down by COVID, but also by things like soaring economic inequality, by rising political polarization, and by falling social distrust, I think it's probably the case that marriage and family matter more than ever for Americans. And we see this, of course, in this particular survey, both economically and emotionally. For instance, single parents were 10 times more likely to experience an economic crisis compared to other groups in the survey. And emotionally, we can see that unmarried members of the survey were about 2 times, like I said, they were dissatisfied with their lives in the survey compared to their married fellow respondents. And then kind of beyond the survey, we see in research, for instance, that sort of stable marriage or stable families often emerge as one of the top predictors of things like economic mobility, educational attainment, and public safety. My work, for instance, shows that on outcomes like college graduation and incarceration, family structure, family stability matters more for young adults than does something like race, a topic that gets a lot more attention in today's public conversation. But again, it's sort of one way to just illustrate that stable families and marriage matter a lot for Americans today. So again, the marriage paradox is this idea that Americans are less likely to be embracing an institution that seems to afford them and their communities so many economic, emotional, and social goods in this moment, in some ways, especially in this sort of COVID era that we're living through. And to kind of conclude, I would say, why is this paradox? And obviously, there's a lot one could say about that question. I think part of the story here is economic, and that is that we've been seeing particularly working class and poor men struggling in today's economy, and that makes them less attractive as potential husbands, makes them also more likely to end up in divorce court if they do go ahead and get married. But culturally too, we're seeing kind of a way in which in the upper middle class, there's a kind of, to borrow from Richard Reeves's, thinking, there's a kind of cultural opportunity hoarding, where many upper middle class Americans, many elite Americans kind of publicly profess a commitment to family diversity. And that's sort of certainly illustrated in some of the findings that we heard about in Jeremy's comments in the survey. But privately, they actually embrace a kind of marriage mindset. They kind of tend to get married and stay married and really appreciate that for themselves and their kids. I see this, for instance, in my own classes where I will ask my UVA students, are you publicly, morally opposed to things like non-marital childbearing? And in overwhelming numbers, they would say they've got no concern about things like non-marital childbearing. But then in the very next question, I ask them, if you were to go home at Thanksgiving and tell your parents that either you are expecting a child or your girlfriend is expecting a child, would they freak out? And when I asked that question, about 95, 97% of my students said that their parents would freak out. Kind of illustrates the point that there is a sort of like public profession of support for family diversity, toleration, acceptance, et cetera. But privately, there is, a dedication to kind of a much more marriage-centered mindset. So I think unless we can kind of address these kinds of economic and cultural issues by giving people both kind of the means and the motivation to forge married families in America kind of across the board, my concern is kind of going forward, we're going to see more family polarization, where the three groups that are most marriage-minded today in our culture, that is the rich, the religious, and the Republicans, will be the ones most likely to form and maintain stable families. And of course, I think that would be a bad outcome. But I think unless we can kind of make some economic and educational changes to lift the fortunes of poor working class men, and some cultural changes to make marriage less of an ideologically divisive issue, I think that our future is going to be one characterized by more family polarization. So that's what I have to say today. Thanks, Carlin.
Thank you so much, Brad. And remember to submit your questions either to samantha.goldstein@aei.org or using the hashtag AFS@AEI. Now, Richard Reeves, it's your turn to react to the survey.
Thanks, Colin. And thanks again to the team for putting this survey together. It's always just a pleasure to work with you. And as with my other members of the advisory board, it's an honor to work on a survey that's creative, but also trying to do a deep dive on some of the issues. I like the way you put it, Colin, that there's an attempt here to get at the tectonic plates that are moving underneath many of the survey results we see elsewhere. So I'll be brief. I'm going to briefly respond just to Brad's observations on marriage and then a couple of additional points. Because I do think that this question of how people view marriage is important and interesting. The way I read the data is that we're seeing something of a privatization of the idea of marriage. And I think that's consistent with what Brad said, because the questions that are softening on marriage are more of the ones which are about marriage is good for society. Generally, it's good to raise. It is that sort of make a judgment about society or somebody else, rather than a kind of personal choice. And there's also a drop in the number of people who say that marriage is more of a burden than a benefit, right? So you could see that perhaps as some kind of success for liberating marriage from the idea of it being a sort of trap, particularly for women. There are fewer people who are saying that. So I would say that what's happening is pretty much what Brad said, in the sense that people are less willing to say that marriage has these sort of collective benefits, spillover, if you like, for the rest of society. But that doesn't mean people aren't still choosing it for themselves, especially those who have the resources. And I would argue that it's primarily about the raising of children, as I've written elsewhere. One of the things that very often comes out of the survey is the similarities that we see across Americans. There's a lot of discussion of difference in our current debate, but very often we'll see it's equally important to most parents to see their role as a parent, as a mother or a father, family being hugely important across all kinds of lines, racial, geographical, and so on. And so I think that message of unity that comes out of the survey is an important one. But actually, I do want to focus on some of the differences. And actually, Marcy's covered some of the economic ones already very well. But I think there are some interesting divides here being revealed that's worth pushing on a little bit. The first of which actually does directly relate to one of the points that Brad just made, which is this kind of familial divide. So we saw, I think, partly as a result of the pandemic, this gap between the families with fewer resources and more resources. And obviously that's economic, but it's also just in terms of time. And so I think one of these big differences between like 2 hands being better than 1 was never truer than when you were home trying to homeschool kids, manage work, etc. And so I think that the under-acknowledged value of time in many of our conversations about families and public policy really flares up in this survey. And you can kind of see how much more difficult it was for people who are doing it on their own. And we probably all know anecdotally as well, among friends and family, just that was the case. So I think this gap in familial resources in terms of time really emerged. I won't say anything more, I think, than what Marcia's already said about the economic divide, except this striking finding that like this was a great pandemic for the rich. I mean, I think we have to be honest about the fact that the upper middle class, it was just, fantastic, great wealth building, credit scores, etc. Financially, I'm not suggesting more broadly than that, but in terms of the economic divide, that really stuck out. The racial evidence, I think, is really interesting, and I hope we will do more on that. And I think this point that Jeremy, I think, really emphasized about this lack of kind of personal interaction, that point about the lack of actually kind of getting to know and work with people of a different race. And that makes me think quite a bit about Brian Stevenson's work about kind of exposure and interaction and so on, which I think is vital to healing some of these divides. So I think that kind of semi-anthropological evidence on this is really interesting. But we also see huge divides attitudinally by politics. So there's this partisan divide which cuts across the racial one too. So I can't remember now when you went through the slides whether you showed this one, but the difference between white Democrats and white Republicans in terms of whether they think Black families face obstacles that white families do not. So it's 88% of white Democrats think that, and only 24% of white Republicans. And so that's a chasm in a pretty important view about racial equality. That's a fairly simple question. Is it harder to be Black in America than white, everything else equal? And there's just like a 60-point gap there. So I think that comes up in other questions too, but we do have a challenge in a large and growing gap in the way that Americans of different political backgrounds view the fundamental questions of race. And you saw that in some of the schooling questions that you did show. But then we also see, I think, some of these culture war issues. I'm putting that in scare quotes just because I think it's obviously dangerous to overuse that label in views of the family themselves. And I think that you've already done a pretty good job of showing that the chart I would show again is the structural, cultural and economic problems facing the family, where actually in a fairly short space of time, as the chart shows, we're really seeing some really pretty significant widening by politics in terms of the challenges that families face. Really a significant decline, for example, number of Democrats who think that it's cultural, and a similar level decline, not quite as steep, in structural. But it's also important that by structural here, we're thinking about things like the importance of marriage. We're talking about family structure. And that overlaps quite a bit with what I think a lot of people would think of as cultural questions. And so you can almost bracket cultural and structural together, I think, in some ways, and then see them in stark opposition to economic, and it's going the other way. So when you see the lines for the Democrats in particular really changing significantly, much more so than Republicans, and what we're seeing is a kind of hardening view, particularly among Democrats, that combined with the opinion polling that we referred to earlier, that the main problems that families face are about money, therefore likely to be solved by money, which I think gets to the point about government intervention, and that is absolutely not true of Republicans. And so that's where the differences in views really start to have significant policy consequences, because if you think that the problems families got is they haven't got enough money, that's very different to if you think that it's around parenting or screen times or instability or drug use or sex or whatever those other issues are, where there used to be a lot more agreement. Then I think it's going to get harder and harder to build bipartisan platforms for policy, which will inevitably have to address both of those. So that, for me, is one of the most disturbing trends from this year's survey. But as I said, it's rich stuff. So thanks again for involving me in it.
Richard, thank you very much. And Marcy and Brad, thank you for your comments. I think you've really added to our understanding of what's in this very rich survey. Now I'd like to give Chris and Jeremy an opportunity to respond to what they've heard from the panelists, to add or subtract from whatever you've heard. Jeremy.
All the comments were great, and I like to get as quickly as possible to people chiming in. So I don't really have anything to add. That we appreciate the comments.
And Chris?
Yeah, I just echo that. We're really grateful to work with Richard and Marcy and Brad, and I think they've highlighted some incredibly important patterns that we're seeing, and I'm eager to hear more questions and talk more.
Well, now let me ask the panelists whether they have any questions for each other or for Jeremy and Chris, and what you'd like to see more exploration of in the next American Family Survey. I certainly hope there'll be another one. Marcy, Richard, Brad? Well,
Yes, I'll just make a quick comment. So as we emerge from the pandemic, right, hopefully by next year's survey, things will be more clear. I think it'll be really interesting to see how some of these attitudes and perspectives and views on families might have changed. So, I mean, I assume we'll keep many of the same questions, right, to have this lovely trend data. But I think also asking people to sort of reflect back a little bit, maybe from the perspective of hindsight. And I think getting at some of these different interactions on kind of the local level, right? We've talked about the lack of interaction across racial groups. I'm kind of interested in neighborhoods and how are people interacting with those around them. I think there's a lot to look toward going forward as the pandemic marches on, and hopefully it will be in the rearview mirror from next year.
Brad, Richard?
I'll just say one thing about the marriage point that I think Brad really highlighted, and maybe this is something to think about how we get at these questions in a future survey. So I think Brad was one of the people who was particularly on Twitter, but more generally talking about the impact on marriage of this change in educational balance. So I'm writing a book about boys and men, so I'm fascinated by what's happening in college completion and so on, where you have seen this quite significant shift. And Brad has been writing about this, and also Prof G did this video on CNN saying it'll be a disaster if we don't have college-educated men. Then the women won't marry. College-educated women won't marry because they won't marry down educationally, and so we'll have all these men. And I'm trying to pull the evidence together on that, and I don't see it. I don't see a shift in relative numbers of women and men with high levels of education changing the marriage rates of women with high levels of education. So they must be marrying down or something. And I think it's really important to get at the question of, like, is the problem with marriage the point that Brad put on, which is a lack of marriageable men at the bottom of the labor market, the Kathy Eden stuff about another mouth to feed? Or is it about the relative position of women and men towards the top of the distribution, where you would worry about things like the gender gap in college completion, which I do worry about, to be clear, but I don't worry about it for its impact on marriage necessarily. So I'm not quite clear. So here's a question, I guess, in some ways, to formulate the question back to you, Brad, is, on the one hand, you seem to be worried about we're not creating enough men with bachelor's degrees because the women with bachelor's degrees won't marry them. But on the other hand, I think you're worrying, and here I think the worry is stronger in my view, about working class men who've seen a massive decline in wages in relatively traditional marriage markets, who are then going to struggle.
Brad, do you want to respond?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it is the case that what we are going to be seeing is that because men are doing relatively worse than women, on the educational front, that's going to mean that there is, a smaller share of men who are earning, the kinds of salaries that would make them, attractive to their college-educated female peers. I think that's potentially part of the story here. And then we have seen, as both Richard and I agree, relative stagnation for men who don't have college degrees in terms of their earnings, and also a larger and larger share of them not being stably employed for men who don't have college degrees. And again, there is this sort of way in which I think for many, particularly middle class and working class and poor women, they, feel like the men in their lives, often, not always, but often don't kind of measure up to the kind of economic expectations that they would, hope. And what's striking is that, Pew did a survey, fairly recently, asking women and men kind of how important it was for their potential spouse to be, employed in a good job. And even today, that's a much bigger concern for women than it is for men. So I think unless we can kind of see a sort of a stronger pathway that sort of meanders both through education and or vocational training, apprenticeships, whatever, into decent paying jobs for men, we are going to see the ranks of the unmarried continuing to grow. And we're going to see a lot of, I think, both men and women expressing kind of regret about their inability to find a partner with whom to share a life.
We have one question on the marriage paradox. Why don't people realize that marriage statistically can help them economically as well as in other aspects of their life? What needs to happen to change that? I mean, this is a big question. Anyone on the panel, but Brad, can we start with you?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the big problems is that the people who control the commanding heights of our culture, in our universities, our schools, the pop culture, the media, tend to sort of publicly discount the importance of marriage and minimize the research indicating that there is a way in which marriage, it's not the whole story by any means, but is certainly of benefit on average to kids and adults. So I think part of the challenge is, can we get the folks who are kind of in the driver's seat in our culture to be more likely to sort of publicly articulate what they often ironically are doing in their own private lives, and sort of as something that benefits people and kids and communities more generally.
Is there a partisan component? One of the questioners asked about marriage today, with Democrats or Republicans believing that marriage is less popular.
Can I say something about that, Carlin?
Sure.
I don't know that we have a direct question where I could make you a chart or point to one in the survey. But what I would say is true, and I think this dovetails with what Brad just said a second ago, is that especially when you talk to people on the political left, for whatever reason, and I think it's a complex set of reasons, saying positive things about marriage sounds exclusionary. It sounds like you are, in a certain sense, not valuing people who aren't married, or not valuing an alternative lifestyle or something like that. I particularly see this with college students that I interact with. And so when I tell them something like, look, setting aside whatever, I'm at a religious university, so setting aside whatever religious doctrine you might have about marriage and just focusing on its effects on society, it's good for kids and families and that sort of thing. And they will sometimes nod, but they will be uncomfortable with the message because it sounds like someone is being excluded. And I'm not exactly sure how you get around that, but that is, I think, a challenge, because it is the case, as we've shown over and over again with this survey, people who are in the institution of marriage are pretty happy about it, whether they're Democrats or Republicans or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's, if I can just jump in, it seems to me that that's really important. So Richard mentioned this before, that people who are in this institution, people who are in committed relationships, they generally find them to be incredibly supportive, and across party lines, people love their families, and I think that's an important message to get out there. The other consideration that I just add to the conversation that Richard and Brad have been having is that I think young people tend to estimate the economic bar to getting into marriage to be much higher than previous cohorts or previous generations seem to assume that bar was. So they not only aren't fully seeing the economic benefits of being married, they see the bar to get married as being higher than it might have been for previous generations.
Any other reactions to that?
If I could just add, Carlin. So I think that if you look at those who are most able to afford not to get married, right, which tend to be the higher educated, higher income people, those are exactly the people choosing to get married. They're much more likely to get married. To younger people say they want to get married in the future. Most people with college degrees have their children within marriage. So I guess I just don't see the crisis to the same extent, because we've had a lot of stability in marriage and preference for marriage, which is quite different from, say, many European countries where those with higher education and so forth, they might not get married. They might wait to get married till they've had a child or two. And so I think that the cultural emphasis among the so-called elites, right, tends to be about marriage. And so I think that perhaps it's more about the opportunity for those that are at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum versus the choice, given that most people say that they value and hope to have to get married at some future point.
Yeah, I'll just say one more thing on this, Colin. I'm sure you're going to want to move on from marriage. But first of all, to completely agree with Marcy, one of the things you discover when you move from Europe to the US is that in the US, the most progressive people you can possibly find in your neighborhood will be married. Their kids will be married, and it would never have occurred to them not to get married. And they feel absolutely no reason to explain why they're married. Whereas that is not true for the same people holding politics constant in Europe. It does, right. It's quite striking when you move. I think, and one observation I've got that's only occurred to me, it's interesting how same-sex marriage hasn't really altered the normative conversation around marriage in the way that I perhaps thought it would. I think it was reasonable to presume that particularly on the left, among progressives, you'd see the victory on same-sex marriage as really changing the conversation about marriage. But I'm not sure that it has in the way we might have predicted. And the way I characterize where we are, where progressive view is on marriage now, is that it's not, marriage is normal, but they don't want it to be normative. I think this comes back to this point about judgment, right? And so anything normative is pretty bad now, right? From heteronormative to whatever normative, right? And so I think that's the key. And so what's happening is exactly this point, I think Jeremy just about exclusionary, which is, I don't want to say this is normative, because that means that if you don't do it, there's something wrong with you. And I think that's where this, but it doesn't mean I'm not going to do it. It doesn't mean doesn't mean I don't think it's great or I want my kids to do it or whatever. It's just that I'm not going to make it normative. So the question I think we face as a society is when can things be normative? Or should they be normative? And how do you decide?
This is a question for Jeremy and for Chris. And the question is, did the survey ask about religious belief or religiosity? And how do you think the decline in religious belief, if you believe that's happening, is having an effect on some of the things you found in the survey, or what effect is it having?
It's a good question. And I'll just say that I do think it's important for us in the future to look more at the distinction between decline in religious belief and decline in religious activity. And I'm just going to feel slightly called out on this, and we didn't present any results on that this year. It is something worth looking at, particularly worth connecting to some of those most important problem questions, I think. I'm of the opinion that we have less decline in religious belief than I think people tend to think, and more decline in religious activity than is actually. And that's probably something we need to look at more in the future. I'll make a note of it.
Yeah, we do have the questions that are that Pew tends to ask about religiosity. We do have denomination, and we have the things like the importance of prayer and how often you attend. So we can do some of that, and I agree. It wasn't a big focus this year, other than to say that people who were involved, or actually Americans generally, not just those who were involved in churches, but people saw churches as doing better year over year with respect to pandemic, the pandemic and aid to families during the pandemic.
Yeah. Here's another question. One of the major findings in the 2020 census this year was the increase in the number of people who identify as more than one race. And I wonder how you think that will affect some of the answers, some of the things you found that indicate sort of a clear separation, social separation between the races in terms of interactions and the like.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's certainly a category that we can explore in greater depth in the future. I do think that one of the things we see this year is the real lack of conversation and activity across racial lines. That's one of the things we've tried to emphasize. At the same time, as the questioner indicates, we do have increasing numbers of people who identify as multiracial, and so I think in some sense those trends are sort of working against each other and or in opposite directions, and that'll be something for us to really look closely at in the coming year. We do want to expand the set of activities that we ask about when it comes to interactions across lines of race. And so I think thinking more carefully about the category of multiracial Americans is a great way to think about that as well.
Anyone else on that? And here's another question, and this one is one that I feel very familiar with. I live in Virginia, and we're about to have a gubernatorial race, and the ad that's been played more than any other is one that the Republican Glenn Youngkin has accused Terry McAuliffe, the Democrat, of wanting teachers to have more of a role in their children's education than parents. What light, if any, does the new survey or any of the previous AFS surveys shed on this division between Democrats and Republicans, if in fact it's a real one? It's certainly getting more attention than any. It's the most viewed ad in the campaign.
We didn't put up results that are, in fact, we didn't even highlight it in the survey. You'd have to look at the top line. But if someone wants to email me, I'd be happy to send them these results. People are pretty generally satisfied overall with their child's environment, education, learning. There's not a deep well of dissatisfaction that we saw when this survey was taken in May. I don't live in Virginia anymore. I used to, but I am familiar with that race. And I think, I don't know, we should probably say a bit about some of the racial differences that we found in the survey. But it was probably worth getting out the point. People are generally pretty satisfied with their children's school, and that's true across races. But it doesn't mean they want things to be taught the same. I'm going to cue that up for Chris.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest divide that we found this year is in how schools take up the issue of race, and the biggest divide of all is between white Democrats and white Republicans. They essentially agree that we should tell a story of racial progress, but they completely disagree about what that means in terms of confronting the challenges of the past. I'm not exactly sure how you tell a story about racial progress if you don't talk about problems in the past at all. So I'm not sure, sort of what exactly Republicans who are uncomfortable with that notion are signaling, other than I think they really do want to tell a positive story, a normatively positive story about the nation's experience with race. But they also just don't want to spend as much time. I didn't show those results in the presentation here, but they're in the public report. White Republicans think that too much time is being spent on issues of race, and I think that's probably because they see this as a politicized topic where their perspectives or conservatives' perspectives won't be represented very well. But they don't want to confront the problems of race in the past, and they don't want to spend as much time on this issue as do Democrats. And again, it's hard to overstate just how big that divide is among white Democrats and Republicans.
Let me remind everyone again that you'll be able to find the results and the full report on the survey at www.deseret.com, and also on the AEI website, on the event page, you'll be able to find it under the related heading overall. Do any of the other panelists want to comment on some of the things we've said thus far?
Just comment on I agree that the finding on schools, the teaching of race in schools was very striking. You wonder what's being heard in those questions, right? In a moment of really heightened anxiety and awareness about these things, the results on their face are nonsensical. I think, as you were just suggesting, Chris, it's like how you could plausibly say, I don't want my kids to be taught anything about the fact that America's had a problem with racism. So that can't really be what they mean. Well, at least one hopes that isn't really what it's meant. It's something about how that's going to be taught. It's something about guilt and etc. Right? So they're hearing there's something. So I wonder if we shouldn't do a bit more work about how school is being thought of, because it's not just race, of course. We've got all the stuff around mask mandates, and we've got, I mean, we're probably close to a federal mandate against state mandates against local school district mandates on masks, right? At some point, right? It's surely only a matter of time before President Biden bans states from banning schools from banning masks, right? But it's all, and you're seeing this kind of so school has obviously always been important to these issues around sex ed and all kinds of other things, but the sort of cheap way to put this is school is now the new, culture war front. But of course, that's not new, but you do wonder the extent to which these questions are really spilling into questions about education policy, and then at what level they're determined. So that could be another thing to really dig in. I'm quite troubled about that. I'm really hoping it will pass. But in the last few years, every time I've said, I'm sure this will pass, I've been proved wrong. So I'm going to keep worrying about it for a while.
We have another question. Oh, go ahead, Marcy.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to add, I think that the question originally asked about parents and teachers. And I think that there's actually a lot of synergy and cooperation in my sense of both the research and sort of anecdotally about parents really supporting their own child's teacher and teachers wanting to cooperate with parents. I think it's some of the levels that Richard was just talking about, right? Thinking about sort of curricula or school districts or mandates where I think parents get increasingly nervous. But I think on the more individual and family level, I think they tend to work very well together. And maybe that's something to unpack further, like my child's own experience versus my perceptions about sort of these broader structures and rules.
I think the other issue is just to be clear that part of what we found is that parents were generally pretty cautious with their children and were okay with large percentages were okay with either staying at home or other precautions that might be taken. It's a relatively smaller number, but a very loud minority that is creating some of the passion around this issue. And I just think that's important to keep in mind, that overall parents have tried to be pretty cautious with their kids, and they appreciate schools doing that as well.
Another question, you stressed throughout that in these surveys, the difficulties that single parent families face, and you indicated, I think, in the report certainly that these long predated the pandemic, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the difficulties that single parent families in particular faced as the pandemic marched on.
Yeah, I mean, we've repeatedly found that the family structure matters, and that the single parents face a set of challenges, especially economic challenges, that two-parent households don't face. Certainly, that was borne out again this year, and I think the other thing that struck me is just the extent to which many married and cohabiting couples found strength and help in their partners. And so it comes out in a variety of ways. It's economically, absolutely, they're the most vulnerable to economic crisis of various kinds. They are most likely to face some economic downturn as a result of the pandemic, and they're the least likely to have support from a partner, just by definition of the single parent household. And so I think that puts them in a situation that involves significant challenges, and challenges that we ought to be aware of, and challenges that affect things like what are the rules for who should get aid from the federal government. Jeremy talked about the fact that Americans are pretty comfortable with aid having some limits of some sort, and they certainly seem to be more willing to help, say, single parents get the help they need in terms of not having, say, work requirements be associated with some of that help, for example.
Can I just say something, one
Sure.
point on this? I actually did some work on the sort of triple whammy that many single parents face, because I think what it showed was the intersection of lots of different inequalities. So we've talked about the relationship between class, whether measured by money or education, and family structure. But then what we also saw was quite big differences in people's ability to work from home and in the extent to which their school districts closed. And so you put all those things together, and what you see is that single parents, and particularly single parents of color actually, had the least money on average, were most likely to live in the school districts that went full remote and stayed full remote for longest, and found it hardest to work from home. And so the question, I think, what it exposes, where's the slack, right? Where's the give? Like, who can pick up some slack? But I don't think we should forget about the shock of school closures on the care infrastructures of families. Now, that was highly destabilizing for most families in one way or another, but for single parents, it obviously was even more destabilizing. And so I think one thing that's not said explicitly in the report, but underpins it all, is the care consequences of the education system could not have been revealed more starkly than they have been over the last 18 months. And I think we will come to really, really count the cost of both the loss of care and the learning loss in much bigger numbers than we can anticipate right now.
We have time for only one more question, and here it is. What do you think are the implications of the emotional toll that the pandemic has taken on American families? Do you think that this will change perceptions of the seriousness of mental health issues in contrast to physical health, and the consideration of more mental health therapy going forward?
Well, I for one was struck by the high percentage of Americans who said that they needed mental health care and were unable to get it. And again, there are inequalities there. They map onto the kinds of inequalities that Richard was just talking about. And so I do think this is an area worth watching. We've seen how families and marriages can be a strength in times of difficulty. Now, as we hopefully in the next year sort of move out of of pandemic times, how people recover from that and whether or not they're able to access additional support, help, including mental health support, I think will be worth watching carefully.
I'll just say one thing, which is that this is something that Belle Stawhill and I have written about in our Future of the Middle Class, Contract for the Middle Class. The UK decided, after some pretty intense cost-benefit analysis, to make cognitive behavioral therapy free at the point of delivery universally to every UK citizen. And I think that that's the kind of policy that we need to be thinking about. CBT as well. And the reason it's so cost effective is because it's pretty effective, but also it costs very little up to a certain point. And so at a certain point, it's just literally everybody. It's just everyone can get it. I know that sounds radical to a lot of US ears, but it seems to me that given the universality of mental health problems at one point in life or another, something more like universal provision would be very welcome in the US, and maybe the conversation will shift towards that now.
Well, let me thank Chris Karpowitz and Jeremy Pope for wonderful presentations, and our panelists, Marcy Carlson, Brad Wilcox, and Richard Reeves, for their insights into this very important survey. And we hope you'll join us again next year for the 8th American Family Survey. Thank you very much.